Okay, well, I guess with that, let's get going. Welcome everybody to our summer installment, I guess I'll call it, of the Oregon Modeling Users Group meeting. We tend to meet quarterly, and typically we have like multiple presentations that we go through. We try the organizing committee for OMUG tries to put together some themes, common themes that kind of thread throughout various presentations. Today we have one theme and one topic, and this is an encore presentation from it was the ITAP meeting, I guess, in Indianapolis here a few months ago. Led by ODOT and with some help from RSG, that received the best presentation award for that conference. So we're super excited to have them. They are local here, kind of our local stars, I guess. And really appreciate them coming I guess back and presenting to our group with this encore presentation, and learning a little bit more about the Oregon Transportation Plan and some of the scenario planning involved in that. So we'll get going on that here in a minute. I believe the meeting is scheduled for about an hour today. We'll see where the group discussions and questions and whatnot go in terms of time, but we're kind of hoping to wrap up around 11 or so. And then towards the end, we'll just give some updates from the group with just various goings on kind of around that may affect the modeling community, whether it be locally or nationally. But with that, let's go ahead and get started here. Carol, did you want to mention anything else before we get going? I guess there's a chat box for folks to go ahead and enter questions as they come up. Carol and I can monitor those. In terms of the flow of the presentation, maybe we'll handle questions and answer those questions after the presentation so that we can keep a good stream of presentation just kind of live and going. We do have a lot of participants today, which is great. I think it's enough to where we probably won't go around the table here and introduce everybody, but feel free to open up that participants little box and private message anybody if you want to catch up with anybody. But otherwise, I'll go ahead and introduce Adam and Jonathan. Adam is a principal planner at ODOT's Transportation Planning Unit. He has over 20 years of experience in transportation and land use planning, and holds a BA in political science and a master's in urban planning, both from the University of Kansas. Jonathan is a director at RSG. He leads strategic modeling practice to support long-range planning and scenario planning efforts for MPOs and departments of transportation. Things like scenario planning and modeling analysis that he has done for the Oregon Transportation Plan. So Adam and Jonathan, again, thanks for coming here and presenting today, and I will let you guys kind of take it from here.
Thanks very much, Carl. Jonathan will be driving the slides, and I like to preface similarly to how I tried to describe our tag team approach for that TRB conference that you alluded to, Kyle, that was held in early June of this year in Indianapolis. You can think of me as serving appetizers for this dinner experience. Jonathan will deliver the incredibly interesting main course. And then I suppose I follow up with giving y'all the bill to talk about what has happened since and where we're going with the Oregon Transportation Plan. So with that, Jonathan, why don't you go ahead and advance our slides? We absolutely want to preface this presentation. It's not a total, or it's not an exact rerun of our TRB conference presentation, because we want to note that we had 2 years of weekly in-depth work of modeling and analysis working group that were members of ODOT staff. That includes Tara Widener, Alex Bettinardi, Becky Knudsen, Chris Melson, who manages TPOW. And then our some external representation on the modeling work group from Kelly Clark. Brian Dunn, who was the former manager of ODOT's Transportation Planning Analysis Unit, was also heavily involved. Kalem Mohabir, who was associated with TPOW, was also involved, and eternally grateful for their involvement in work. And that would include a special shout to Tara Widener, who is in ODOT's climate office, who was at the TRB conference and helped coach Jonathan and I with some great tips and observations before we went into delivering our presentation. Next slide. Okay, so there are likely several of you in the audience who have either seen this, have seen some iteration of myself presenting on the Oregon Transportation Plan, or anyone at ODOT involved. This is just a kind of background explainer, and recognizing that the TRB conference, you know, most attendees were from non-Oregon locations, and so we really wanted to prime the audience. And the OTP is I suppose, the high-level overarching policy plan for ODOT and the state. It actually encompasses the entire state system. It is policies and strategies that considers the entire transportation life cycle. It is a visioning element of statewide planning that goes out to horizon year of 2050. It's definitely multimodal in nature. It definitely has elements that relate to the work of other state agencies, as well as region and local entities for consistency and coordination, et cetera, with the other statewide mode and topic plans, as you see depicted in this graphic, but also all the way down to the local transportation system plans in Oregon. Next slide. Okay, so what I wanted to do in presenting to this conference was sort of front with the fact that, you know, my own training and background in urban planning comes with some philosophical leanings to consider what it is we want to achieve and how we wanted to execute the Oregon Transportation Plan process. For the record, I was the agency project manager for the Oregon Transportation Plan project. That included not just leading internally the teams and the work, moving up our executive level chain all the way up to the Oregon Transportation Commission, but the consultant team, which was led by our prime consultant, HDR Engineering. But as it's very important to relate here, Jonathan Slason, who is my partner in presenting, is with RSG, and they were a very strong sub-consultant and team member from start to where we are now with the project. So definitely put in a meta-epistemological kind of frame to how it is we wanted to execute this process of considering a large amount of uncertainties in transportation for, you know, Oregon in the present and the future. Considering a who, why, what, and how, and playing to strengths of the process. So it's about what do you apply to the process and where. I'll talk a little bit more about applying a prescriptive and a descriptive element of the plan, and absolutely about making complexity of the system relatable. And a big moving aspect of that throughout the project was our scenario planning work. Next slide, please, Jonathan. So perhaps some of you have seen this diagram. This is taken from Robert Goodspeed of the University of Michigan's Scenario Planning for Cities and Regions. I believe it came out in 2020 and 2021. Correct, Carol, you are on the hook to have to use the term meta-epistemological in practice. Anyway, this diagram really represents how we can think about transportation's place within the larger dynamic of multiple systems, and the fact that we're really looking at the physical world as well as an spinning up to ecosystem dynamics. And Jonathan, if you advance, I think it has the next explainer box. So I just want to explain that thinking of this graphic really, to me, was important to make explicit the relationship dynamics that goes into such a long-range, high-arcing plan. It's about people and communities. It's about people and institutions. It is the relationship of people with infrastructure as well, and the natural environment, and as I was mentioning, networks and flows, things that really spin up from not just the transportation system, but other means of how energy flows, commodity flows, etc. So that was a real grounding element to how I thought about scoping the approach to the OTP process, certainly along with other valued team members. Next slide. So back to what I was talking about on positioning the prescriptive with the descriptive. In thinking about the process, the prescriptive elements are really, and this is taken from ideas from Goodspeed in the Scenario Planning for Cities and Regions book, is determining what is the information we need and a prescriptive approach of how we're going to get there. How are we going to make informed choices and come to an agreement? So some tools we instrumented in the Oregon transportation process is a project management plan, a public involvement outreach communications plan. Any of you who've gone through long-range planning processes, these would probably look familiar in elements you would scope, as well as charter agreements between the entities involved. In particular, our chief advising steering entity for the plan, the Policy Coordinating Committee. Yes, media releases, communications were certainly a major element, as well as background reports and white papers that were completed in the lead up to the plan to help us in how we were going to frame existing conditions and how we were going to think about designing our scenarios and what were the points of emphasis, what are the kind of goals and objectives we want to achieve. Next graphic there, Jonathan. So descriptive is where we come to the public, is how I think of it. It's asking them questions so that they're actually informing how we're going to carry the process forward. What is happening in transportation? Really trying to get from members of the public, how is the system working or not working for you? What are the issues that you see as needing to be brought to the fore? Obviously, in a statewide plan, there are going to be many different perspectives. Some of that's based on geography. Some of it's based on people's own communities, their own involvement, even socioeconomic class. We try to consider those things and how we did a very robust outreach process for the Oregon Transportation Plan. I'm going to note that given we started this process in April of 2021, excuse me, and to sneak preview, we got to adoption just a month ago, that this process for convening our advisory committees and reaching out to the public was done entirely virtually, using Zoom platform, using the Microsoft Teams platform, and other web tools, as well as some of these tools you'll see we utilized in outreach. A virtual open house, we basically had a couple earnest rounds of that. We did convene focus groups, but again, those were done virtually, with a couple exceptions for folks who did not speak English as primary language. We did have some in-person outreach there. And then transportation personas, which Jonathan may mention later, was a analytical tool we built to be able to relate and put people in their own respective kind of way they may utilize transportation in thinking about our scenarios. And then back to the prescriptive, because given what we got through the descriptive aspect, and given what we know, what would happen if questions are really what we set to do in our scenario planning work? Jonathan's going to talk a lot more about that. And then those tools that we list there. Next slide. So drivers of change may be a familiar term to many of you in the audience. It's really just exogenous pressures, in this case on ODOT, in other transportation agencies, the things that really we want to frame in terms of trends, these kind of organizational thinking, so that we can get towards what are our priorities, what are top of mind issues, what are the threats, what are the opportunities and benefits. Social equity is threaded throughout this Oregon Transportation Plan process, as well as climate. I will note that while it's not explicitly stated in here, issues around public safety definitely were also front of mind. But we've taken big, hard looks at demographic issues, population, labor force changes, economic framing, industry composition trends, emerging transportation technologies, and definitely looking at how this plan will be resilient in the face of an uncertain future. Next slide. So this development process needed to have pen to paper on what kind of objectives we had, and our ingredients, if you will, for achieving an Oregon Transportation Plan that is outcome driven. Jonathan will explain some aspects of how we get to an outcome driven plan through the scenario work. But really helping our chief advisory entity, the Policy Coordinating Committee, as well as the ultimate adopting authority, the Oregon Transportation Commission, understand the users and the uses of the system needs today and the future, and about how we brought best practices to this process, and about how we sought subject matter expertise and a variety of other experts that could come to the plan process, balancing a lot of different perspectives and needs, as I alluded to earlier. And how this, and this should be ringing familiar to a lot of you who've gone through long-range planning, how you set a vision, but one that is actionable, and about making trade-offs because of the realities, the constraints that we truly are working within in the plan. And with the next slide, Jonathan, I think this is going to be my transition to you after I'm done here. The vision and value statement in the Oregon Transportation Plan is that Oregon's transportation system supports all Oregonians by connecting people to places in the most climate-friendly, equitable, and safe way. We bolded the climate-friendly, equitable, safe way aspect because those represent three primary lenses that really shape how we get to priority actions in the plan, including targets that we'll talk about later. But this vision statement also set the stage for developing these goals. And these are the foundational goals that in the plan that also were the organizing instrument to how we formulated our scenarios approach of mobility, safety, sustainability, climate action, economic vitality and livability, stewardship of public resources, which really does encompass how we make decisions on prioritizing investments and having to consider a variety of means of gaining getting revenue, and looking at a very uncertain trajectory with the gas tax, and then social equity, which, as I mentioned earlier, is threaded throughout the plan. And next slide. And Jonathan, I believe this would pass to you, and thanks for driving.
Great. Thanks, Adam. Thank you, everybody, for being here. So as Adam said, this presentation was oriented toward a national audience. So we'll have some slides that I think many of you will be quite familiar with. But to initiate where we are is that, as Adam mentioned, we're in the OTP. We changed the orientation, and it became quite clear early on how different it was because of the tools that we had at our disposal at this point. And so what makes the OTP particularly unique is that as an outcome-driven plan, we look at things in a different way, and our scenarios are developed in a different way than what would be in a traditional scenario planning approach. And I even say traditional in air quotes, because the traditional scenario approach isn't all that old. And we would say the traditional approach is more of a normative scenario development approach. And the way that happens is that you develop a baseline future, typically called as a reference scenario. You then identify what tools you're going to evaluate your scenarios with, and you develop your MOEs, your measures of effectiveness for those models. Then you develop those normative scenarios, and that's those points in the future where you're saying, we don't know quite what's going to happen, but this might happen, this might happen. You have to come up with a number of permutations. Then you iterate and you test those scenarios against your goals. Now, Oregon has been leading the way nationally in this. Many of you were involved in the STS and other actions at the state level, where we now have new capabilities at our hands. But earlier, when we developed these, we had to go through those permutations more manual and involve people and say, well, how does the future unfold? What are the types of changes that we expect? So as the OTP is an outcome-driven plan, what's the difference? Is that you first evaluate a baseline future. That's the same. You also identify your measures of effectiveness. That's the same. But what makes it particularly unique are the two bullet points in the middle, is that what you can do is identify a range of feasible inputs. So those inputs that you had to manually kind of put together into the puzzle pieces in the traditional approach, in the normative scenario approach, we can give more continuous ranges of those scenarios. So for example, we said, well, how about transit service? It's going to go between a low and a high level. And we actually specified in the model inputs how many revenue miles that would mean. We talked about inputs of ITS and operations. How many ramp signals are there in the system in the low and the high ranges? And so what that allows us to do then is build an extensive domain of possible futures. And then we're able to mine from those futures which scenario best achieves our goals. One method of doing that is that we have to create a crosswalk between those MOEs, which is in the right-hand side of this table, which many of us who are aware of the tools that we're using, so I'm going to say it, Vision Eval and the strategic travel model, that allows us to have over 100 to 200 types of measures that we're able to withdraw from the model, depending on which geography level that we're interested in. What we landed on was a handful of measures here that we could communicate more clearly. The public could understand them. They were tied to the goals and objectives that were being developed in the plan. So quite early on, we had to do this crosswalk and merge between what was happening in the parallel process that Adam articulated that took many months, which was to gain alignment around the goals, and within the goals, some objectives. Once we identified what those objectives were, then the modeling and analysis group said, well, what are the best measures that we have to try to say, are we going and achieving that particular objective? Why this crosswalk is particularly important is that allows us to compare at the output level, are we achieving our goals? And that is what really distinguishes this plan being an output-driven plan, is that we can avoid the horse trading that typically is involved in the development of normative scenarios or the particular inputs. And we can say, well, we're going to evaluate all of those inputs, everybody, and then focus on the particular outcomes that best achieve our goals. And through the public process, we were informed what goals are our priorities. Are they all equal? Are some goal areas emphasized over others? And so we were able to explore that in the tools that we were developing. So in these tools, which was the Vision Eval framework that I'll give some thanks or call outs on the next slide, but we were able to evaluate then a range of results in the future years. And so rather than just, I think you can see my cursor here, rather than just one future scenario in year 2050, we are able to evaluate many, many more possibilities of how the future might unfold for any particular model outcome. And we were able to do that in the exploratory scenario of planning framework, the XSP that Robert Goodspeed was mentioning in his scenario planning book. We then were able to do, we're calling it goal seek, which was to mine from all those various futures to identify what were the inputs that led to that particular outcome. What further makes this approach unique is we applied the exploratory modeling and analysis tool, the EMAT interface that has been developed. And that gives more variation than just a stochastic variation of inputs, which is another way that scenario planning has been done. You can say, what is a distribution of a particular input, and say, well, it varies across this and this. We actually said, we didn't give it that type of narrow range. We allowed inputs to vary dramatically more widely than that. This plot here on the far right just gives, again, one particular connection, one XY pair. We compared the urban mix proportion, which is the share of housing in a more of a mixed use neighborhood. We're able to say, well, what if 100% of the future land use was occurring in mixed use environments? How would that change our total daily vehicle miles traveled in the model? And there were a couple scenarios that you can see each dot, even at that high range, we still had high VMT because there were other things happening in that particular little dot. But then there were a few dots down here, a couple scenarios that said, hey, we get to really achieve our VMT goals by maximizing how dense can we go. So that's just one example of one scenario that we're investigating. So at this point, Vision Eval, the strategic model that we've been working with, this is the audience that we don't need any introduction to what this tool is. Oregon helped create it. Brian, Gregor, thanks to you and your work over the years, you're on the call here. So now more recently, Jeremy Raw and the FHWA team. I think I said Jeremy's name on the attendance list here as well. So the Vision Eval is being supported by FHWA. Oregon DOT, as well as several MPOs, are members of the pooled funds. And that pooled funds effort is continuing to develop and support the tool. Tara Widener and the Climate Office also is continuing to support the tool, and it's being used at the state level for this plan, but also it's been used, I think Taya was on the call at the Metro, been using the Vision Eval tool for the target rule setting, and other MPOs are going to be using it in the state more soon. So this tool is being supported, it's actively being used. Oregon is the national leader. And we were able to take advantage of the tool because it particularly addressed the questions that the OTP was looking at. How can we get to a lower VMT per capita targets? How can we reduce our GHGs? And how can we do it in ways that we can talk about what policies would lead to these things? What types of investments, what types of decisions do we need to achieve those goals? Another graphic that everybody here would most likely be used to seeing, so I don't need much of an introduction. But what is particularly powerful is that we can use the vision eval framework and the strategic model strength to be focused at that high level. This OTP, hands down, it was in new territory for us. As an applier of the tool, RSG and the modeling analysis and working group, we didn't have a textbook to follow. The scope of work that we had, we said we're going to develop the scenarios, but how to communicate them and how to translate them into meaningful numbers and outcomes that the public can understand. We didn't have much guidebook, and we were creating the process as we went on. And this toolkit kind of helped us to say, this is high level, where are we going? But how can we start to move it into tactical model communication? How can we give more clarity and definition to some of the scenarios that were being produced? So it was always top of mind how to stay at the high level to evaluate and have the freedom, but then also try to translate that into some meaningful actual numbers that people can understand. So part of the process to get there was that we developed this simple pathway. We said right from the start, any typical model, we validated it because the model was predating this team's arrival. We validated it and updated some core modules. I want to give a call out to Aditya Gore from the RSG team. He was instrumental in really leading through a lot of the technical background. He helped us confirm that the models were doing the right thing. We found a number of little adventures along the way that we had to address, from code changes to updates to model platforms and other things. So we've introduced other pieces that I'll discuss on the next slide about automated vehicles, teleworking. We updated a multimodal module to reflect a more recent National Household Travel Survey. So all of these things were done early in the process. We then did something really unique, which was developed a cost-constrained environment that the vision eval was working within. And this was helpful because we were constrained in our inputs and our outputs so that we were investigating scenarios that were plausible. And that provided us a lot of ability then to make the model more practical, more useful as we're getting toward implementation. And so we developed these linkages between the revenue side. So how much in a 2050 scenario, we converted all the user fees, gas taxes, et cetera, into a RUC environment. Maybe it's presumptuous, but we worked under that assumption that by 2050, we're going to be in a VMT, a RUC world. Again, not that much of a leap for Oregon versus other states. So we identified how much revenue would be collected by all the users on the road transportation system. That gave us a budget, and we related how much revenue are we collecting to understand how much would the total budget be with FHWA contributions and other revenue sources like vehicle registrations. So Alex and Becky were absolutely important on that connection between developing how much revenue is the model estimating and actually what is a real dollar budget in money that we can say that's the money that we have available to reinvest in our system. So that's the cost side, is that we looked at the actual investment levers that were being plugged in the model. I have this slide on the next screen to go more into those particular investments, but we put dollar values on every revenue mile, every extension of ramp meters, every lane mile increase. We put real dollars to those. And so we were to relate, if we were to increase our investment, it increased our cost, but we could only do that up to a cap. And that gave us this constrained environment. We developed input across all of this process. We looked at all the regional plans. We looked at what the current trajectory was going forward. How much investment are we making across the state? How are we doing it geographically? And all of that informed the input files. We then went to town and started playing with the levers, as you do in EMAT, and developing the scoping files. We ran the EMAT interface in Vision Eval to produce hundreds of scenarios. And within those hundreds of scenarios, we then allowed the exploratory modeling machine learning framework to develop meta models. And so these are models of models. And once we ran the meta models, we could then change any of the inputs much quicker, and we were able to explore thousands of possible permutations in the future to give us a more continuous range, where the 500 model runs that inform the meta models had more of all those orange dots, where then the meta models filled in a whole continuum of various possible futures. We were then able to relate those meta models to the particular measures and goals that the plan had. So these are some of the inputs that we talked about. We had land use density, roadway capacity. We talked about increasing funding for active travel, bike lanes and the like, walking sidewalks, transit revenue miles across the state. We talked about how to provide additional electric vehicle charging infrastructure. We talked about travel demand management. That was in the phase 1 component, which really informed the core OTP outcome. In the phase 2, which is still being written up, but we've explored how the OTP scenario would actually be adjusted in light of further uncertainty. So maybe we can come back again in another 6 months or a year and say, hey, look, at the phase 2, we said, in light of increased electrification or in light of increased teleworking rates, these are the things that might actually affect or maybe mitigate the need for making certain investments. Or let's say if energy prices decline dramatically, does that suddenly stimulate a bunch of new travel demand? And does that cause us increased challenges? Or does the arrival of level 5 driverless vehicles suddenly cause us to rethink some of our particular policy objectives? So this is the phase 2 piece that we're able to start to explore because we've built in these capabilities into the vision eval model. Now, I've already discussed a little bit, but I was trying to be clear here earlier presentation about what particular was novel in this application. You can see the decision-making under deep uncertainty cover that many in the call were involved in. We use that interface to help us evaluate and test out all those scenarios that I was just describing. But beyond that, it was that revenue and cost interface that allowed us to have feedbacks and say, this is a constrained environment. If we start making investments in one category, that means that we cannot make all of the investments in the other categories because we were cost constrained. And how to make that multi-criteria trade-offs part of the process. That was particular novel and what required a significant amount of time from the team. And when I say the team, it's everybody that Adam mentioned on the front end of the call. So a little bit more sense about how we, information about how we used it. We first did constrain ourselves. We explored a lot of variations, but we focused on a constraint within 4 funding levels. We looked at to say, what if we were charging our users the same that we charge ourselves today, which is about 1.9 cents per mile? And then what if we bumped it up by 4x and explored what a 7.6 cents per mile equivalent, what would that do to travel behavior? In each of those scenarios, we were able to develop a budget. And this is a figure that has now since been shifted from the OTP, but for the communication in this group today is that we found that there was a budget number that was $10 billion if we charged ourselves 4x. The nuances I'm not going to go into, but is that as costs went up, we didn't generate the same revenue per mile as we once did at the 1.9 cents. So the model accounted for some of those behavior changes as the cost of driving increased. So we were given a budget constraint. We looked at the cost per mile of travel. We then developed all of these runs. We ran 500 core runs at each funding level that turned into 16,000 scenarios of meta models. We then were saying, well, how can we make sense of 16,000 runs and how 16,000 scenarios? We developed a bit of an interface to start to basically score which scenarios best achieved our goals. And that's what I'm going to show you here, just walk through a little bit of animation. This is a Shiny tool dashboard that Reed Hafer from the RSG team helped develop. And it was an internal facing tool. It didn't go out to the public. And what we used were that these criteria, we identified key goals that you'll remember that crosswalk. And then we have identified the objectives within the goals. Then there were the MOEs within each of the objectives. And we said, well, what if we start weighting and giving scores to any of the goals and objectives and the measures themselves. What the study did is that we said in the OTP, it was determined that all the goals were weighted equally. And so we were able to identify which measures were best capturing the objective, and every goal was weighted equally. And what happened was that every scenario then evaluated with how well does it meet the particular goal, objective, and measure. So I'm going to walk through just a couple more screenshots. We uploaded the meta model CSV to the Shiny app. We then went through and put a weight, and in this case, just simple ones for these particular goals, objectives, and measures. Then what happened was that we normalized, or we put into a 15 percentile bin how every scenario did. If you performed the best, you were given a 15. If you performed the worst, you were given a 1. And then at that point, we simply did kind of a sum product or a scoring rubric of multiplying the weights of your measure times your percentile score. And what we were able to derive was a total score for every scenario. You rank that highest to lowest, and you can say, well, these were our top scoring scenarios. What then we were able to mine from that is that if you can imagine this table goes hundreds of columns, we know exactly what the inputs were that were associated with these top scenarios. And by knowing what those inputs were, we were able to say how many roadway lane miles should we be looking to build, how much supply should we provide for EVSE equipment, what types of ITS and operations investments should we make. So this is how we were able to derive from the outcomes that we are interested in to understand how the inputs related. I'm going to end up here near the last slide so that I can turn it over to Adam, and then we can take a little Q&A. So apologies, I'm going a little over. These were our key outcomes that we were looking for, or excuse me, our key investments. And we said, how do our key investments change over the course of our decision-making cycle? These red marks say, well, what if we had other emphasis areas? What if we prioritize mobility or preservation over the OTP in general? We might come up with other investments. We might spend more on lane miles, for instance. But if we prioritize the balance of all of the goals in the OTP, those are all the blue little circles here. And the darker the circle meant that it would be the scenario with greater funding available. What this gave us some information on is that even as funding increased to achieve the OTP, we would still be in a relatively constrained area about how many new lane miles, for example, we might want to consider investing in. TDM, for instance, also fell within a range, but it was on the higher range. This is an input scale of 0 to 1, which relates to the EMAT input scale, that you put everything in a low to high range. And so we were able to make this is a communication to say, if we had certain other outcome and priorities, we might invest differently. But with the OTP being our investment priority, this is the range of and where we would recommend the investments to be oriented. Now, I will leave us to say this was the analytical, the quantitative, computer-driven approach, which was since, I think, supplemented with some human-driven intervention near the end, where we said, some of these things, if we have enough money, why don't we invest in them? And for instance, TDM, it's a relatively small amount of money, $14 million kind of at the high end. When you're looking at the scale of preservation and adaptation being $5.7 billion, we said, well, there's very little harm for us to shift a little bit of extra money from preservation and into the TDM category. So the OTP itself, that Adam will talk about the implementation here, is that we did change a little bit of the priorities here at the tail end to go above and beyond where the computer would have led us to believe. So Adam, I want to turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. And I'm going to try to be speedy here so we can get to some discussion. I will note, Kyle and Carol, that I'm happy to stay after 11 o'clock if there are questions that possibly I could field in terms of the planning process, et cetera, that I may be glossing over quite quickly from here on. So this slide is to illustrate, how, again, we're trying to bring the prescriptive and descriptive effectively, where there's technical process and there's the gathering of the input, there's relating our findings from the scenario work to the public and how to get some meaningful input to them so that we know where we're putting emphasis in the plan and where we're ensuring how we've communicated the goals and objectives. Next slide. And what we've heard back and learned, I think Jonathan actually hit on a few of the key points. I would say executive leadership, my management chain on up to the Oregon Transportation Commission, really sought for the balanced outcome scenario that's optimizing across the 6 OTP goals. They're recognizing that some of those outcomes could have been strengthened, but the impact, the balancing is you see efficaciously that you're producing co-benefits out of the scenario's work, and we needed to daylight those co-benefits and really show how things are intersectional across those goals. And yes, most public comments on the scenarios, and we had a public comment period from March to mid-May of this year of the draft Oregon Transportation Plan, were supportive of our blue sky scenario, that 4 times amount user fee that Jonathan talked us through. And yes, there were tensions observed and out of the feedback, and I can't get into it too much detail here with time, but definitely we saw that, reducing VMT per capita as goals has a contrast on measures of travel time reliability and other measures, performance measures around mobility, for example. Jonathan, next slide. So here is the postscript element. Since that TRB presentation in Indianapolis in early June, we hit the biggest milestone, at least for me it was, that the Oregon Transportation Plan has officially been adopted by the Oregon Transportation Commission. They did so in their July 13th, 2023 meeting. From the public release draft that was released in March to where we got on the final approved plan, we introduced actual goal area targets in the plan. They're with the horizon year 2050 to achieve 20% per capita VMT reduction, 77% per capita reduction on carbon emission. We will be developing targets around social equity by 2025. The reason we had to put that as a sort of placeholder in the plan was because we need to be in step with the agency's Office of Social Equity. And so we will be amending the plan soon to bring those targets in, as well as we have safety targets. They're really vision zero oriented on eliminating fatalities and serious injuries on Oregon's transportation system. So we do need support in bridging the gaps between where we are today versus the vision. This group is, to me, a key player in where my work is going to go in implementing the OTP. The process itself and getting to adoption was step 1. Now we're in step 2. And I'm highlighting here the key pieces, because whether or not I actually am charged to develop a formal implementation plan for the Oregon Transportation Plan that would be, say, approved by the commission, it's a sort of a game board with a lot of pieces. And these are some of the pieces I see. One is, you may all know, we're about to initiate a major update to the Oregon Highway Plan. ODOT has a strategic action plan, which is more of the short-term element of implementing the OTP. There are in motion right now updates to the regional transportation plans concerning any of our MPOs in the audience, as well as a lot of updates to come on the local transportation system plans, because that ties to the next bullet on being in compliance with the climate-friendly equitable communities rulemaking. I also just have to put out there that we anticipate in the 2025 major legislative session, there will be a transportation reauthorization bill taken up. Cannot say for sure though, if that spins up to the governor's priority in league with the legislators on if they go there, but I expect we're going to hear a lot and talk a lot about that in front of 2025. And I think that the connections with the OTP are paramount and need to be an aspect of how we're going to work with partners. And I'm saying we as ODOT and our other agency partners. And then I'm just to highlight there the 2027 to 30 STIP, Oregon's ODOT's capital investment program. And next slide. Really, for me, I wanted to bring the question to this group, and I see it as a continuum. You know, we don't just leave from here and that's that, but this is something I do want to hopefully have a little opportunity for discussion about the biggest challenges you see in topics for monitoring, thinking about performance metrics, thinking about how we're going to achieve those significant targets that we've put in place in the OTP. And to, I suppose, invite that, you know, Carol and Kyle, I would certainly be glad to come back if there are some ways I can report on where we're going with implementation or tee up other questions for this group in particular to talk about. And with that, I'm going to conclude. And thank you very much for the opportunity. I really appreciate getting to talk to you all. And that project website link includes the adopted Oregon Transportation Plan document, as well as a lot of supportive materials that went into development.
Okay. Great work, you two, and several behind the scenes, I can tell. And I now see why you did win the award for best presentation. A lot of work went into this, and I think you two communicated it very, very effectively. So I appreciate that. We are getting close to 11. Adam, I appreciate your sentiment about staying over a bit. We'll see. I guess we'll see where things go. We are scheduled until 11, but I suppose if some engaging questions come up, we're happy to kind of continue on it. I think, Carol, do we have this Zoom session until 11:30 or so? I mean, it's not going to time out at 11, will it?
I scheduled you guys, the speakers, to 11:30, but
Okay.
everyone else to 11. So
okay, all right. Well, everybody type in your questions, I guess, in the chat box, and we'll try to answer them as quickly as possible. Before we do that, I do have one question. Not quite sure who it's directed to or who wants to answer it, but can you guys remind me of the scale here in terms of geography that you're implementing these policies around? I guess what the scale of the OTP is, and it wasn't quite clear to me if is it statewide, or you talked a little bit about some tactical models. Just give me a sense for the scale here that some of these policies were implemented at.
I think, Jonathan, I'll just front a little bit that you could probably speak to in terms of how we developed our approach to the scenario work and the model scaling. But, Kyle, just as far as process and the policy reach goes, the scale has to be all the way down to local and neighborhood streets. I'll just make a quick note that any of you who are familiar with ODOT's Blueprint for Urban Design effort, where we really sought meaningfully putting appropriate land use context to design decisions, which is now actually a part of the highway design manual. We also utilize the topologies of those contexts in policy in the OTP. I hope that gives you a little sense of what the scale means from the statewide aspect down to the local community level. But Jonathan can probably speak a little more about actual technical process there.
Yeah, I think just to answer it quickly is that the vision eval structure has the statewide as the region. We modeled every county, and then within county, it varied in terms of the size. There is no physical geometry to sub-county, but it was more about based on a synthesized sub-county level. So I would say it's more of a census tract kind of geometry below the county. But what we were able to do, to Adam's point that he mentioned earlier about personas, is that because every household is synthesized, every household is modeled in the vision eval model, we're able to draw out how certain households with certain characteristics were impacted by the model scenarios. So we were able to model a household in Grant versus a household in Lincoln City, and how different they were reacting to the model scenarios. We were also able to account for households with different income profiles. So the synthesized population gave us a lot more insight onto the sub-geographic changes.
Okay. Thank you. And maybe let's see here, just going through some of the comments here. Maybe that leads into this first question from Nassim. Let's see, what were your base data for vision eval? If it is scenario planning for 2050, our base inputs for 2022.
Right. Tara put some answers in there, is that there are a few versions of the vision eval model. The particular one that was updated for the OTP had a base year of 2015, which we developed inputs in concert with the ODOT team. But we were able to query all the regions, RTPs, and other long-range plans to collect all those inputs for 2015. And then the effort was to establish what a 2050 horizon would look like.
Okay. Next question from Dan Cody from WashDOT. When will the multimodal module be available for pool fund users? How many of the tools used in this process will be made available at an open source level?
Technically, they're all available today in a location that we can decide. Tara, I see you're unmuted. The question is really, is it ready for prime time? Is it ready for other locations? It is definitely ready for prime time. We used it in Oregon. We had a lot of confidence in it. But again, I think there's a conversation about what gets pushed to the federal branches and repos at this point. So Dan, I think you're on the pooled funds effort. So I think there's a conversation that will live on beyond this call.
Yeah, I would just add right now we're trying to figure out which GitHub, forking we're doing off that development. So it will remain like an Oregon specific until the pooled fund pulls it back into the main branch.
So Kyle, I think we should close out the official meeting, and then we
Okay.
can hang out a little bit longer if there are still some other questions.
That sounds great. Okay, so upcoming events. Thanks again, Adam and Jonathan. Really appreciate you taking the time today. Great presentation. So next OMUG events. Again, I mentioned kind of themes that are coming up for future sessions. We're looking at trying to bring in a few folks from ODOT and Metro in particular to talk about mobility policies. So moving away from levels of service, VC, I guess, measures of levels of service, and more into speed kind of bins in terms of mobility policies. Another one would be bringing probe data into travel demand models. We'd like to form and have more of a discussion around land use modeling. and greenhouse gas modeling updates. Other ideas, you can certainly submit other ideas either directly to myself or Carol or Li Ming or Garth Aponitis, or simply go to our OMUG website. I think there's a submission form there as well if you have other ideas or other topics that may be of interest to you. There's a handful of conferences coming up now through mostly in the fall, I guess, with the conclusion of the or I guess I should say start of 2024 with the TRB annual meeting. One to note here, I guess, is the one in Portland here next week. The ITE International Conference is happening locally here. So if anyone's going to that, I know there have been some announcements flying around for volunteer opportunities for that. Feel free to, you can message me directly and I can get you connected to the folks that are doing the signups for any volunteer opportunities there. Let's see. Other than that, I think that will about wrap it up. Thanks. And there's the link to the website, and appreciate everybody's attendance today. And we'll be looking forward to an announcement this fall as to the next OMUG meeting.